a submission on. So just if there were any points of clarification at the outset, otherwise we'll move through topic by topic.
It's just a curiosity. I'm just wondering, how does, with the highly productive land thing, how does that have any effect on the decisions we've already made in terms of Plan Change 6A? Is it?
It doesn't, no. Plan Change 6A is already partway through its process and had already been identified in the district plan as a future urban area. So it isn't impacted by the NPS HBL in its current form or by the proposed amendments that are coming up. But where the NPS HBL amendments would have impact is in relation to those longer term growth areas that are identified in our growth strategy, but also to private developments outside of growth areas on Class 3 land.
You might cover this off when we get to it, but I'm just interested in your comment, particularly to the Papakāinga, that fundamentally what they're looking to bring in remove some of the barriers, but there doesn't apply to other barriers that may exist inside district planning. So I'm guessing, are there improvements in that or further refinement within the district planning process that we need to be thinking about specific to Papakāinga based upon the direction that we're getting out of this as well, to try and make that easy?
So the other barriers that impact Papakāinga development aren't so much district plan based as they are the nature of the land being typically more at risk from natural hazards than general title, or problems like banks being hesitant to lend against Māori land, for example. So they're not, this proposal basically all but does remove the district plan barrier aspect, but there remains these other barriers that are sort of outside the ambit of resource management, but nonetheless, I guess, drive inequity in development potential and opportunity.
Insurance on a lot of the stuff's going to be key, isn't it? Because the interpretation, is it going to be definitive enough that people will pretty much come to the same conclusion? Because it's all subjective in terms of some of where they're sort of interpreting the matrix or what is the risks. Seems quite hard in terms of that it's taking the responsibility away from us to actually make those decisions.
So in terms of insurance, in terms of the ability of landowners to get insurance, or insurance in terms of council's insurance? So I think probably what I would say is that this doesn't take away our decision making.
Right.
Rather, it gives us greater tools to make more risk-based decisions. If we have the information and the evidence available to us to make those decisions. So I think in terms of the impact that this would have on insurance, I think inevitably if a piece of land is identified as having significant risk from natural hazards, sort of inevitably that will impact people's insurance. But I think that would be happening regardless of whether we had a resource management tool to manage it or not, because ultimately insurance companies are becoming more and more aware of hazards. And so whether you regulate and control that hazard or not, in a resource management sense, I think there'll be insurance implications anyway.
Thanks, Lana. I just wanted to understand a little bit around the Horowhenua District LUC one. Just, help me understand that a little bit better.
Sure. This one came as a surprise to me also, and I think we've talked a couple of times at this table that as part of the coalition agreement, the coalition government had committed basically to amending the National Policy Statement for Highly Productive Land so that those restrictions that it imposed would no longer apply to Class 3 land, and it would instead only apply to Class 1 and 2. Now that approach is what we sought in our original submission back in 2019, and it reflects the approach we take in the district plan, where we have quite strict subdivision rules for Class 1 and 2 land, but we're a bit more relaxed about Class 3 land. And that really reflects the nature of land use in this district and the relative, value and usability of those soils. So that was what we were expecting to see when the material was released. However, what was released instead is a proposal that the restrictions on Class 3 be removed everywhere except for Pukekohe and Horowhenua. And the idea behind this, because I have now had that meeting with some of the staff from MPI, I guess this approach was developed in response to concerns from the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Resource Management Reform that removing the restrictions on Class 3 land would undermine food production in key food growing areas like Pukekohe and Horowhenua. And so they asked that this exclusion be excluded for Pukekohe and Horowhenua. However, the time frame at which that request was made and when the material went out meant that they didn't really do any analysis or any testing about whether or not food production was actually happening on Class 3 land in these two areas. And secondly, whether or not Class 3 land that was being used for vegetable production, whether or not that was actually at risk from other land uses such as urban development or lifestyle subdivision. So they're sort of acknowledging that this idea was put out with this sort of view to protect national food security, but they hadn't yet had sufficient time to understand the problem and to test whether the solution that they were proposing was an effective answer to that problem. And so something that the MPI staff were really keen to see from us in our submission was how effective we thought that would be. Now, probably just to take it up a level, the tool that they're calling this approach is called a special agricultural area, and they are proposing to provide a pathway for other districts or other regions to have areas of land identified as being a special agricultural area. An example that springs to mind for me would potentially be somewhere like the Heretaunga Plains in Hastings district, where that land isn't Class 1, 2, it's not Class 1 and 2, so it's not protected by the MP's HBL, but it has its own set of unique properties that make it very valuable for food production, and so they wanted to provide a pathway for those sorts of examples to be protected. So I think that is a concept is beneficial and aligns with, I guess, the overall intent of something like this. However, the key difference between that approach and the proposal that's on the table for Horowhenua is that in other districts, if they wanted to identify special agricultural areas, they would do so through a typical plan change process, where it would be subject to a Section 32 analysis, which is an RMA tool where you have to evaluate other options. It would be subject to submissions and hearings, where parties would have the opportunity to test the council evidence, present counter evidence potentially, and ultimately through a plan change process you have that final step of plan changes being appealed and ended up in the Environment Court. So I guess the process is robust, it's subject to a high level of scrutiny, which is not proposed to be the case for the sort of automatic protection for Pukekohe and Horowhenua. So I think there's probably two things to consider there. The first is, does that sort of blanket protection at the national level for Horowhenua run the risk of, I guess, perverse outcomes because there hasn't been sufficient opportunity to test and challenge the evidence? And secondly, the element of fairness and why some regions can determine at a district or a regional level for themselves what should be protected and what shouldn't, and why for other areas such as us, central government would dictate that for us. But I think having now met with the staff at MPI, they seemed pretty open to taking an alternative approach and quite receptive to the view I expressed in that meeting, which was that I didn't think there was sufficient evidence to justify such a sort of a heavy-handed approach, as well as some concerns about, I guess, the fairness and the equity of taking that decision-making away from the local level and the local community. Because the thing with national policy statements is this is basically our one opportunity to make a submission, and so we don't have that appeal right, we don't have that, like if they decide to go in a different direction or they decide to impose this, we don't have any ability to challenge that in the Environment Court, for example, like would be the case if it were a typical plan change.
So, at the risk of getting down to the weeds about our situation, from what we know at the moment, would it be fair to say that the Class 2 land is pretty much hill country, the foothills, and as such is not particularly useful either for horticulture or for housing?
Not for Class 2. Class 1 and Class 2 is really good for vegetable growing production. Class 3 is still somewhat flat. The hill country tends to be sort of even lower than that, but the Class 3 land, this map is, I had to snip this from the presentation that MPI did the other day, so it's a bit small and a bit blurry, but they've identified on this map land that is Class 3 and is being used for vegetable production. A couple of caveats to that is that in this map, a farm that had any Class 3 has been tagged as though it were all Class 3. So some of those blocks of purple land, for example, it could be a 10 hectare block of land and 9 hectares of it is Class 1 and 2 and 1 hectare of it is Class 3, but it's been picked up as though it's all Class 3. And it also doesn't show O2NL, so I know it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a block of Class 3 land being used for vegetable production identified on this map. So it's sort of portrayed as though this approach would protect that, but that's right under the path of O2NL, so it's already lost to vegetable production anyway. So I guess I have some concerns about the methodology behind this map, and yeah, MPR staff were very open to that and keen to get the map right. But my sense from looking at this and from doing a bit of a drive around and drilling into our maps in a little bit more detail is that there's not a lot of food production happening on Class 3. It's primarily happening, not none, but it's primarily happening on Class 1 and 2. And I know sort of anecdotally that some of the growers are buying up the more fragmented blocks of Class 1 and 2 land around the district and hiring shuttle vans and minivans to take workers down to work on those smaller fragmented pieces of land as opposed to expanding on the more cohesive Class 3 land blocks around Levin. And I'd like to assume there's reasons for that, and it's because the Class 1 and 2 land is more effective, even with those other constraints like having to drive people down there.
The growth areas that we've identified are mainly, are any of them Class 3?
Yes, so yep, the LS7, which is the one south of Taureka, that's Class 3 from memory. However, because those ones are already identified, the ones that are already identified as being needed within 10 years of when the growth strategy was adopted, those are still able to proceed. They're not being picked up by this. And so that's sort of where we're at in terms of needing to understand the problem a little bit more and test what the evidence is telling us is this Class 3 land, one, is it actually even being used for the purpose that it's been portrayed as? And secondly is, would that Class 3 land, if it is being used for food production, would it actually be at risk from being converted for other purposes in an inappropriate way? Because if they're quite small blocks or they're quite remote and quite isolated, then they're probably not under significant risk of being converted from food production into some form of urban use. And probably the thing to bear in mind is that the MPI and the two ministers that I identified are thinking about this and framing this in terms of a national food security objective. So they're probably less concerned about what the impact of this might be on our particular urban growth plan, but would perhaps be interested in knowing that this will restrict the use of land but not actually protect national food production, if that's the case.
Thanks, Lauren. I was going to ask for those maps and that anyway, so it's good that I see them there. I think for me though, it's one thing to understand the use of Class 3 land. I think what I'm trying to say is, what is the Class 1, 2, 3 lands that are used now and even recently, maybe in the last 10 years? Because while we're talking about land use 3 blocks, how much of Class 1 and 2 has already been lost to vegetable growing and agriculture? Because for me, that's relevant to, if we're trying to protect an industry here that supports this district so strongly, then we need to understand what's already been potentially lost through other processes. So have we developed class 1 and 2 lands for residential development and what have you? Because for me, it starts to inform me about land, classification 3 land, about, should some of that land actually, even if it's small and unused and what have you now, does that actually inform about the wider picture to protect the national growth process? The other one I was thinking about was, is Māori land encapsulated in this? Because there are many Māori land blocks out there that are also have growing operations on them. So I just want to know how that's captured. And then the last one for me was actually around the water exemption case. I'm wondering whether the water exemption case had something to do with informing the minister to protect LU3 lands. Sorry, there's a bit in there, but yeah.
No, that's fine. So I think in terms of your first question about how much land class 1 and 2 has been lost to non-productive uses over the years, we probably the most effective way we can answer that question is by looking at what subdivision is occurring on that land. It's much harder for us to track if someone has just voluntarily transitioned from a vegetable farm to some other use, some other land use, for example. But we can track, and we have tracked in the past, subdivision activity on that land. And I most recently did some analysis on that for our 2019 submission on the highly productive land proposal, and that did show, quite a significant drop-off in subdivision on class 1 and 2 land when we brought in stricter subdivision rules ourselves. And my sense would be we can track it that there'd be even less occurring on class 1 and 2 from 2019 through to now, because this has been in place, which is sort of a bar up again. Second question was around Māori land has various exemptions under the National Policy Statement for highly productive land. Now what that means is, it means that the land can still of course be used for highly productive land, but it also gives Māori owners the opportunity to do other land uses rather than being restricted to just vegetable production, which is the case for non-Māori land that is picked up by this. And so those provisions they're not proposed to change.
I suppose why I asked that is because earlier on we talked about papakainga and some of those barriers that are there, and so that's the relevance for me. It's actually, how do you marry that conversation when we're discussing stuff like, that's all. I'm just trying to join the dots myself.
Cool. So I thought, in terms of framing what a submission might look like, I had put the MPSHBL in here first because I suspected with the Horowhenua focus it might be the one of most interest for the table. So far I've committed to provide some more information and evidence to MPI to help them understand the nature of land use within Horowhenua. I also said that the ministers are always very welcome to come and visit us and to see in real life how land is being used. But to sort of turn our thinking to a submission, the discussion document or the consultation material asks some key questions, which is probably where our submission is best targeted. And so in terms of the Horowhenua specific ones, those are sort of bolded at the bottom. And so interested to hear from the table where feeling might be sitting in terms of the use of special agricultural areas, to the identification of Horowhenua as a special agricultural area at the national level, and if we did support that, to say so. If we didn't support that, what would we instead consider to be appropriate pathways or criteria for identifying special agricultural areas?
What are our growers likely to say?
So I haven't had a chance to engage with them yet, but when I spoke with some of them back in 2019 when we were preparing that submission, they were, I guess, quite frustrated, of being locked into how they could use their land. And what one in particular highlighted is that some of them were relying on, I guess, the value that potential subdivision had for them, in terms of the capital that gave them and their ability to then borrow against that to expand their operations. And then once their subdivision potential was completely shut down, they then didn't have the same value in their land that they could then not borrow against it. I guess, so unless things have sort of changed significantly, their view probably hasn't changed. However, I suspect that it's not so much our growers that would be affected by this proposal to retain protections to Class 3, because I don't think there's a huge amount of vegetable production happening on Class 3 land. I think it's more likely to be sort of pastoral farming, grazing land that will be affected by this.
Look, my instincts at this stage, Lauren, are the second of the two options. One of our concerns
on the first iteration prior to the new proposals was that basically there would be very little we could do in terms of development in our district. So that my personal support lies for option 2, about it being removed.
Yeah, I see we still have to have some sort of control of our own destiny. I don't think we should be submitting on the grounds that let them do to us rather than us deciding what the future may be. And, you know, if we've got enough significant pressures probably with growth that's going to happen over the next 20 years to suddenly have national policy statement that limits our ability to be able to be flexible in terms of what we want to do, I wouldn't be in favour of that at all.
And I guess my response to that is that we then move to question 2, which is about where the control should lie, Bernie. And as long as we could have that level of assurance that it could be done locally, then I think we would have pretty much a win-win situation. But I agree, I share your concern that in agreeing to option 1, it could well be that we're overridden, because the general direction of this new legislation is about less control at a local level and more control at a national level. So that's the risk we take if we do go with option, the second of the two options.
It kind of goes back to this plan change 6A thing, though. A lot of the, for me, just as an example of, like, a lot of the opposition to that, people I talked to, was that, you can't get rid of, you can't, you shouldn't be using highly productive land for basically housing. So the thing being, though, is that no one was going to use that land to grow vegetables anyway. And it's kind of like, so I wouldn't be wanting to be in favour of anything where central government or government generally can dictate categorically what people can do with their own property. So, philosophically speaking, that's kind of where I sit on that.
Yeah, that's where I'd like to know what the growers, if they need, do they need more land? Are they going to be expanding their operations over the next few years and maybe having to use some Class 3 land because they've used all of Class 1 and 2? It would be interesting to understand whether they see a future in terms of where their growth is, and because one of the issues that I've been aware of is the number of small landowners that are probably not going to be around in the next 5 to 10 years, and if the bigger guys don't take that up, what's going to happen to that land? Will it just, even if it is 1 and 2, what is going to happen to the land? I mean, I can see why we need special dispensation, because they do need that food security sort of stuff is pretty critical, and could be very important in terms of where we go as a district as well. So I wouldn't like, there is a balancing act there somewhere along the line in terms of ensuring that we do maintain enough potential land for future growth in that space. You're the expert, I'll let you.
I think to summarise what I'm hearing is that we're open to or support the concept of special agricultural areas because we acknowledge a need to protect land for primary production and vegetable production, but we don't support that being dictated to us at a national level. We support the tool being there, but for different councils in different regions and districts to, through their own plan making processes, explore the issue, explore the solutions, test the evidence, and then test that in the public and with stakeholders through a submission process. Does that kind of articulate it? Okay.
I'm interested in the pathway towards other areas being specified as special agricultural, because I kind of look at, well, us in Pukekohe, with the food basket, we're already producing vegetables to the extent of a population of New Zealand of 5 million. Are there other areas or other direction steps that they need to be exploring to actually expand that food bowl into other areas, and how are they doing that rather than potentially expecting that to necessarily be picked up by the two existing high priority areas that they've spoken about? So I'm less concerned about the central government dictate, because I think that they've got to be mindful of the control, but any loosening of that would probably be welcome.
I like the way you framed it too, Ryan, but picking up on your points too, Clint. I agree. I do get worried. It is great that we look for other food baskets around the country, but we have one. So it's actually how do we protect it, enhance it, because I'm sure that's what the growers are going to say to us if we were to ask them. But there's a whole lot of work that we need to consider too to mitigate some of those other things that go on from those operations, which is why the exemption case came around in the first place. So I'm definitely, but the other thing I'm very mindful too, it's a national strategy. And I think we should champion national strategies, because at the end of the day, we have seen the way it's operated in the past, and we've seen whole areas being wiped out for production through natural events and things like that. I mean, I just think about East Coast and what's happened up there. Look what's happened in Nelson recently with the loss of all their vineyards and everything have been wiped out. So there's definitely a need to ensure that we have growing land available to feed our nation, not to house them as a primary. And again, I go back to what have we already given up in Class 1, Class 2 from this district that's actually not supporting this statement here.
Any other comments on a general approach for this particular topic, or shall we move on to MPS infrastructure? Cool. So as outlined, the national policy statement, or the proposed new national policy statement for infrastructure, is about providing clearer consenting pathways for infrastructure. As I highlighted, it changes. The key changes is that it changes the baseline of effects. So effects only need to be mitigated where practicable. You have to recognise the benefits of infrastructure, and that we have to recognise that infrastructure providers are best placed to determine where their infrastructure should be. There's also some wording in there about needing to consider internationally, nationally, or regionally accepted standards and methods to manage effects, rather than necessarily being expected to produce bespoke management approaches every single time. So I guess the benefits and costs of that are probably will speed up infrastructure consenting projects, and we've experienced firsthand how long those processes can take and how much they can cost the community generally. But the trade-off for that speed is that there may be some effects that are unmitigated, and I guess the the ideology here is that those effects are acceptable when considered in the context of the benefits that infrastructure provides.
So who decides we're practical?
So ultimately it would depend on the decision maker. So if it was, say, a resource consent, council is the decision maker, but if it's a notice of requirement, then typically the infrastructure provider, who is both the applicant and the decision maker, unless it's a case that's, say, referred to the Environment Court, like Horowhenua was, in which case the Environment Court would make the determination on whether that was practicable, whether they accepted the applicant's evidence, basically, that they'd have mitigated to a practicable level.
Do you get a sense that that's quite loose, though, that sort of, it's almost giving carte blanche, sort of acceptance that, they'll just be able to roughshod over any of those adverse effects?
I've gone back and forth on that, because on one hand I'm sitting here thinking, well, if we flipped that wording, are we saying that you have to continue mitigating effects even when it's impractical to do so? And we wouldn't, I guess, be encouraging that approach, but I do think that there is risk that where we've moved from, I guess, an overall kind of balancing of effects and benefits, we're now saying quite outright that if it's not practical to do it, don't worry about it. Yeah. That said, and I haven't got all of the figures off the top of my head, they're all available online. The percentage of an infrastructure project's cost that is associated with consenting is much higher in New Zealand than it is in the rest of the OECD. So there's probably some element of, we're probably like the sweet point's probably somewhere in the middle. And probably the other element of wording that piqued my interest in particular was about decision makers needing to recognise that infrastructure providers should determine where infrastructure is.
Because the classic example I can think of is the wastewater project in Palmerston North. If they decide they want to put treated water into the Manawatu River, that's, we're practical and probably $200 million less expensive than doing it. So it could easily. So there's no appeal rights in terms of these things either, is there? No.
There's not typically for big infrastructure projects, because often those big ones like Horowhenua or like, I don't know what will be the case exactly for the wastewater one that you've identified, but if those projects are referred to the Environment Court, they're typically that's the end of the road. However, the Environment Court's sort of the end of the road anyway, as opposed to a council hearing and then the Environment Court. The tension is where a project like the wastewater one that you've identified is that Palmerston North City Council would be the requiring authority, the decision maker, unless it was Environment Court, but the effect is primarily being born elsewhere, and then our community or this council's role is basically as a submitter. There is still regulatory roles, but ultimately that notice of requirement process does give the requiring authority and the applicant a lot of power in the process.
That part is a given. We know where the government's going on that. So, we can submit around other issues, but, good luck.
And so I think if there's nervousness around that test of where practicable, then I think the nature of a submission would be strongest if we were recognising an acceptance that some level of effect arises from big infrastructure projects, but what would that appropriate baseline of effect be? And if it wasn't where practicable, what would the alternative that would be acceptable to us be?
Thank you for that wording. I think that'd be very helpful for review.
Anything further on that? Those risks that we've just talked about are probably the key areas. But as I say, it's a pretty big and meaty document in a another very big and meaty document. So there's, I guess, an element of where do we want to focus most, knowing that there's 17 national direction instruments out for consultation at the moment, and yeah, do we want to focus in on a couple of key ones, or do we want to do something quite broad across all of them?
Probably for me, it needs to focus on that number one priority for them in terms of, you know, what are the infrastructure benefits, and that would be the only thing that I think we should worry about really, if we've got any concerns in that space or not. Obviously the direction of travel for them is they've already decided that those three are the main priorities for the, you know, for infrastructure, so they'll continue down that path regardless, but if we can sort of tweak or make changes accordingly would be good. Yeah.
So, National Policy Statement on Natural Hazards. As I said, the main change here is that it introduces this risk matrix that allows that you follow basically to determine whether risk from natural hazards is significant or not. So anything that has a medium, high or very high impact is considered a significant risk and is therefore subject to this National Policy Statement. As probably outlined in the summary material, the biggest area of concern from my perspective is how we actually go about implementing this, rather than the fundamental policy direction. And so perhaps the nature of a submission could focus on the need to ensure that councils have got appropriate implementation support.
Because how does this dovetail into the emergency management stuff? Because no doubt they'll be telling councils that they've got to up their game in this space as well, I would imagine. So is there any risk that we'll get landed with lots of imposition in terms of introducing this stuff?
I think where this sort of sits alongside the emergency management stuff in this is that this is focusing on controlling new activities, so expansion, so controlling where subdivision and land use development should occur, and when it does occur in hazard-prone areas, making sure that the risk of the natural hazard is appropriately mitigated effectively. So probably a different direction or a different font on the same issue, but I don't see too much overlap between the two pieces directly.
Just thinking, Blair might be able to help me there, in terms of, you know, wider area rise and things like that. When we permit development and then it has an impact in terms of stormwater or whatever, the liability there, I know I don't want to get to the weeds of that, but does this have, you know, should we be identifying those sorts of risks before we allow those sorts of things, or making the developers do it differently or something like that, rather than sort of just carry on? And I know it's about the best available information, but often hindsight's a wonderful thing when it comes to this sort of stuff.
Personal view, short answer, yes. I think personally, I think it's key to the more we understand about these spaces and can get ahead of them, the better. In terms of informing people that may or may not be going in that direction, but you know, the space is continually evolving around mapping of water and others. That continues to evolve. You know, LiDAR and all sorts of stuff. The information we have available to us allows us to make better decisions. So, I think short answer yes would be my view.
And I think to add to that is that this National Policy Statement gives us better tools to do the yes, to be able to say, well, look, there's now this National Policy Statement we are required by government to implement, and you've got a significant natural hazard risk here, so you need to provide us with the evidence and the information to show that it's appropriate to develop in this area and that the risks and the effects of that development are being managed.
And so the pressure point on the other side of that is the cost to provide the best level of information in order to progress whatever project it happens to be. So potentially there's going to be a significant increase in ask for to reach that best level of information threshold that will be put on to those that are looking to develop, correct?
That's right, is the what is best available information, who's responsible for producing that best available information, and I think that second part of the question there comes down to who benefits the most from that information, and how are those costs of obtaining that information fairly and equitably shared, given, a lot of times, information might be relevant to this development here, but then it has broader benefits or information, relevance for others. And so I think while it's sort of easy to say, well, developer A who's applying for this subdivision should produce the best available information, sometimes the best available information will, by the nature of the hazard, need to be driven at a district or a regional level. And so what pressure may council, whether it be district council or regional council, what pressure may we come under to have best available information upon which to make our decisions on? And if we don't have best available information, what then in the context of resource consent decision making? Any particular, in those sort of questions from the consultation document, beyond sort of what we've talked about, is there any particular area there that you want to drill down on in any more detail?
Can you just, that second point there, just expand on that a little bit, and why not infrastructure and primary production?
My sense is that not primary production, because this is largely focused around people. And so I think they're saying, actually, if a piece of land is at risk from flooding, then it being used for grazing is a good use. In terms of infrastructure, I think that's because I think there's a sense that infrastructure proposals, by nature, will consider the susceptibility of natural hazards. If you're building O2 now, or you're building a new wastewater treatment plant, the investment that you're making in that infrastructure is such that you want to be sure you're building it to be resilient from natural hazards, and so there isn't perhaps the same need to drive protection as there is for someone who's doing a 10-lot subdivision, or someone who's maybe building their home in a flood-prone area, for example.
And I assume you're comfortable with very high, medium, and low sort of bits on that. It looks very evenly spread, though, doesn't it?
This risk matrix isn't. It's not perfect, as any matrix would be, but it's also not unfamiliar or new. Like, this sort of classification has occurred for some time, and so I guess effectively by picking up that medium risk, you're basically saying an activity that would have a minor impact, but is almost certain to occur, or is even as far as is possible to occur, that should be considered. So even minor flooding, if that's likely or frequently happening, is probably going to have an impact on people and property. So I guess that the idea is that should be considered. However, I would expect that through the decision-making process, it would be easier to mitigate a medium risk than what it would to mitigate a very high risk. And so you might mitigate a medium risk of flooding, say, by imposing minimum floor levels, but you might accept that, and I'm kind of, coming up with scenarios on the top of my head, perhaps the vehicle access to that property might still be impacted in a 10-year flood event, but perhaps you might make that trade-off that so long as the home's okay, if your vehicle access is flooded and you have to stay home for a couple of days, that's a level of risk that you're prepared to accept, and that would be an appropriate mitigation. But if the risk is, or if the severity of the hazard is major or catastrophic, so in terms of major, let's say that means that your home's going to be wiped out, you probably wouldn't accept that level of risk.
I suppose ultimately we're looking for a more efficient and effective system to be able to, big criticism of the current structure is that it's costly, it's time, it takes too long and stuff like that. So I suppose if the intended purpose is to increase that efficiency and effectiveness, then it's got to be naturally a good thing, doesn't it? Yeah.
And so I think a tool like this it'll be more effective in controlling natural hazard risk. It'll probably be more efficient in the sense that it'll be easier to say no quickly to inappropriate activities. But there probably, and this is often the case where you've got a big effectiveness gain, is that there is always, I guess, some efficiency trade-off there too. And so where is that? It's that balancing act.
I suppose for me too, Lauren, looking at a matrix like that and then listening to all the different pieces of the puzzle, the different legislations, the district plan, all of that stuff, and it's good you've given some of those quick verbal examples because I was sort of trying to draw them out of my mind, but I still have this tiny slight bit of me that says, is it enough though to give the information that we're required to make an appropriate decision? Because using models like that don't always reflect. Let me put it this way: you can quickly bypass around things by using a model like this to present it how it is. But I'm guessing you've got a whole lot of things to draw upon to influence a decision using that, because every one of them will have their own criteria, I suppose, to meet.
Yes, I think, a matrix like this sets out, I guess, an expectation around evidence testing and analysis, but that the individual resource consent process would be where you'd weigh up all those other factors. What something like this doesn't do is it doesn't, I guess, acknowledge that different people or different communities' ability to tolerate risk or their resilience to risk varies. So if you're able to afford expensive insurance, for example, I guess your resilience to risk is higher because you can pay to insure your home, and when you get flooded out, you can go somewhere else and your insurance will pay and you get a new home. If you can't afford insurance, then your resilience to that risk is different, and that's, I guess, where, say, a resource management tool like this, it can't really address those sorts of things. And that's, I guess, so it is an imperfect solution, but what it is trying to do is trying to avoid, I guess, large-scale development happening in inappropriate places.
I was just going to say, because if you can afford to do it, you can afford to do it, and you'll do it anyway.
Any more comments on that hazards piece before moving on to the freshwater package, which is quite a meaty one, and then the last couple to touch on.
My only comment, Ryan, really to finish that other one off, is we talked a lot about people, but we didn't talk about the environment and capacity of the land itself and what it can take. So that's the only comment I wanted to just add into that space.
So in terms of freshwater, the government is seeking feedback, I guess, on the overall approach and the overall objectives for managing freshwater resources under the new system. Now those changes are quite significant. So I'll give you a moment to read the material there, which is a refresher of what was in the video, and then perhaps discuss whether we want to cover this in a submission from there.
probably support all three of those, to be honest. Maybe the third one with a bit of a tweak.
What's the link at the end there on 3 with commercial vegetable growing? I don't.
So this is, I guess, in response to the concern that the previous freshwater package made it too difficult for some areas, like vegetable growing areas, to be able to continue their operations because they weren't able to continue their operations while also improving freshwater quality within the catchment. Now that was acknowledged somewhat in the MPS FM areas like Horowhenua by us having that particular exclusion or longer time frame to achieve those freshwater improvements. But my sense is that perhaps other areas in the country are raising the same issue. And so the proposal is for a particular set of standards for commercial vegetable growing to be included into this freshwater package so that those are acknowledged in their own right. And I think that's linked to the highly productive land piece of work. I guess to summarise the changes on the table at a higher level is the current national policy statement says that when you're managing freshwater resources, the first priority is about the health of the waterway. The second priority is the health needs of people, so basically drinking water. And then the third priority is about economic, social and cultural wellbeing. The proposal that's on the table at the moment is that hierarchy approach would go and it would be replaced by a new objective that puts health of the waterways, health needs of people and economic needs all on the same playing field. And that part of doing that would be acknowledging, I guess, that water quality improvements take a long time. It would include an analysis of the cost of those freshwater improvements and who should bear that cost, and then that there would be a particular pathway and a potential set of standards to enable commercial vegetable growing, whether that aligned or otherwise with broader objectives for freshwater.
Personally, I prefer the hierarchical approach because without that top priority about the life supporting capacity of fresh water, I can't see how the other things follow, and the risk about putting them on an equal footing, we can see where that will go. There will be compromises. Rivers and so on will be compromised because now it's all things being equal. So I would personally very, very strongly advocate for the hierarchical approach.
We can certainly take a submission in that direction. I do note that that's not one of the 3 options that the discussion material is asking for feedback on. However, we are always able to suggest alternatives not covered within the consultation material.
I totally support what you're saying to David, because I think you're right, and putting them on a level playing field as such doesn't give me confidence that the matrix will deliver how we see it. Yeah.
So to frame it as a possible submission point is I guess a pathway to say, look, the preference would be for that hierarchy to be maintained. However, if that is not the favoured approach, then a rebalancing to put those priorities on the same playing field would be supported, where that was underpinned by like a national bottom line that kind of said that the health of the water, they're all equal so long as the health doesn't drop below a certain point. And I guess to take that a step further, that those bottom lines for the health of the waterway be best set at the national level or best set at the regional level?
Will be national, I feel, yeah. We don't want dirty parts of New Zealand, we want clean parts.
So we've already kind of covered those options and the nature of that conversation. So unless there's anything there that you want to expand on, probably.
I suppose the question for me would be, since they introduced the hierarchy of obligations, has there actually been an improvement in terms of water quality across the country? Because it's all very well to have hierarchical sort of obligations, but if they're not actually measuring stuff properly, or we haven't seen any improvement, then what's the point?
I'm not a freshwater scientist by any stretch, nor am I particularly experienced in regional council consenting. But my sense is that this hierarchy of obligations was only introduced in 2020, and 5 years is a relatively short time period in terms of seeing water quality improvements. When you think of activities that are already operating under existing consents that might not lapse for another 10 years or whatever it may be, and that would be expected, I guess, to take longer than 5 years to see measurable improvement. And we've touched on this a little bit as well, in that they're seeking to advice or feedback on whether or not to include particular pathways for protecting commercial vegetable growing. And so I think in terms of how we respond to this one, we probably need to be weaving a consistent message between the highly productive land national policy statement, the comments that we make about freshwater, and the pathways, I guess, for enabling commercial vegetable growing, and making sure we're being consistent in any messaging there. And again, this might be one that, in terms of, we probably don't have enough information and the experts to be able to determine what those standards should be. But whether there is a preference in terms of those two options as an approach at the conceptual level. Yeah. Is there a preference for option 1 over option 2? So the key difference is that option 1 is about just having an objective that supports a national policy statement, and option 2 is about having a national environmental standard that would set rules.
Option 2.
In the interest of time, did we want to provide feedback on this, given these changes probably aren't going to be helpful for this council, given we're sort of already underway in a process for addressing things like water security and storage. We've got the National Environmental Standard on Grady Flats and Papakainga left to cover, and we can park the going housing growth conversation and pick that up again at a later date because we've got more time.
I just, so, we have to think Page Road's only for living.
So I guess the question then is, do we support a national standard that would make the construction of off-stream water storage permitted? And if so, what have we learned from the Page Road reservoir experience that could help inform an appropriate set of standards?
I think when you think nationally as well, if you had a policy like this in place, then there would be less need for us to build a Page Road development, because this policy standard would then apply the fact that longer term we would have less reliance upon that facility or any such facility elsewhere if we had this written in our standards as this is just the way we do business. And for me, it kind of makes sense, because I'm assuming it doesn't go as far as meaning that those homes in Levin that don't have off-water provisions would have to then get it.
I think what this is proposing to do is to enable things like Page Road, rather than for individual dwellings to have on-site rainwater collection tanks. That's more to help with that sort of civic infrastructure level.
I just worry, and Lauren, you would have expertise around this when they talk about national standards. given the uniqueness of each of the catchments and the awa and so on, whether national standards could be too inflexible. What are your thoughts on?
I think there is a risk of that. And yeah, as I haven't actually delved into the draft standards that they're proposing yet. And yeah, as I mentioned, I don't actually have much experience at all in regional council consenting, so I don't know whether my review of those standards would be whether it would add that much weight. But I can have a look and see if there's any immediate red flags, and perhaps link in with Daniel and his team, given what through their experience with Poets Road, to determine whether or not those standards are workable at the national level, or if it's actually just too complex, and instead just sort of policies supporting it could be an alternative approach.
Yeah, because I'm just linking it back to the importance of the health of the awa that we've already talked about, and the consequences of some blanket standards across this, which might compromise the awa. Yeah, the need to be flexible to respect each awa, and it's, but thank you. So you'll dig deeper.
How does all this to do with water going to fit in with local water done well? What's the us?
So these policies are about how the freshwater resource is managed in terms of effects on the environment, rather than being around who is actually doing it and managing the costs and the affordability, etc. So probably the key change would be that the new water entities would be the applicants, rather than the council might have been the applicant in the past, in terms of something like water storage. But ultimately, with some of these other freshwater elements, it's say someone is applying for a water take for farm irrigation, for example, and council at this stage, or the regional council, if they still exist, will be the decision maker as they are currently, but they'll be making decisions based on this new package of objectives and policies. So it's not so much around the civic water supply as it is about the use of water from various different parties and the effects of that on the environment. So in terms of these next two national environmental standards, firstly Papakainga and secondly Granny Flats, as identified in the briefing video, NES Papakainga is significantly more enabling than the district plan, in that it will allow up to 10 dwellings on Māori ancestral land as a permitted activity under the district plan. It doesn't address some of those other barriers that we talked about before, and probably the other key thing to identify here is that the proposal is that it wouldn't apply to general title, and that's because Te Puni Kokore, who drafted this national environmental standard, were concerned about this being misused by non-Māori to do other types of just typical housing development and call it Papakainga. However, that does then mean that, say if someone had Māori title and they converted it to general title, they now can't use this, even though they do have a genuine ancestral connection to the land. Now, one of the areas of feedback that Te Puni Kokore are seeking is how could a set of standards be drafted that would allow Papakainga to happen under this on general title, but in a way that didn't allow it to be exploited for non-Papakainga development. I did have an idea for that, and it would be perhaps to retain the standards as they are for Māori ancestral land, so it's permitted on Māori ancestral land, but then introduce a new consent pathway saying Papakainga would be a restricted discretionary activity on general title, where those standards are met, and where the only matter of discretion would be around proving that ancestral connection to the land. So that would mean it would still need a resource consent, but it would be just limited to someone proving that ancestral connection to the land. So it would be much, I guess, less arduous than what the process would be right now. I think it's an imperfect solution, but that was what I was able to come up with in the last couple of weeks, kind of thinking about this.
In practice, this might be crystal ball gazing to some extent, but what would this effect would this have, or what would this have changed or could change or affect the situation, ongoing situation at Hoki Block?
I might need a little bit more information about.
Could any officers give a background on that? Or I can give my potted view if you like.
Thanks, Councillor. So, yeah, I guess the only update would be it would still be an active compliance matter, and it is still an active compliance matter for council's officers to keep monitoring.
I was thinking more in terms of would this actually just make that all okay, in terms of they can do pretty much what they like down there.
So development, what this proposes to do is it proposes to override district plan rules in relation to public housing. It doesn't propose to override Building Act rules. You'd still need to go through the building consent process, and it doesn't propose to override regional plan rules for things like how effluent is managed on site and things like that. So it doesn't just make it sort of a free-for-all, you can do whatever you want. There are still standards that need to be met in relation to this type of development. Does that clarify?
I think your suggestion around the imperfect workaround probably works, because that, as it's written, is as imperfect as any scenario could look like in terms of providing flexibility around how it would be applied, by maintaining the intent around what it's driven to achieve. So
I support that too, yeah. Just from me, Lauren, I just want to pick up on Māori ancestral land and whether so I'll give you an example right now. We have land exchanges going on within our local roading project where they are Māori land owners that are losing their land, and there's potential for them to do land exchange that's not Māori land, it's general land. And so is this going to allow them to be able to conduct papakainga in the future, given the status and the change of their land ownership? To them, the whenua is still the whenua, and they'll still feel like it's Māori land because that's the purpose of the exchange, but it's not the whenua that perhaps they were that they have inherited. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point to make. I'm just casting my eyes down the list of land that is considered Māori ancestral land under this proposal, and I don't think the scenario you've outlined is sufficiently covered here, so I think that could be an additional submission point, that land should also be picked up as Māori ancestral land if it has come about through a land swap where the land, or a land exchange where the land has been acquired for a public work or whatever it might be.
And another scenario to perhaps consider is that there is now the ability for general land to be turned back into Māori land through the land court. So I just want to make sure that we're somehow encapsulating that conversation. I don't know where it fits, sorry Lauren, I haven't gone into the detail, but yeah.
No, that's totally fine and good questions to ask. My read of this is that if general title was converted back to Māori title, that would be picked up by this. It's more, I guess, where the biggest gap is the land exchange scenario that you've just explained, and land that was Māori title and then was converted to general title for whatever reason, that it's that land that isn't, or it might have always been general title but has a genuine ancestral connection, and that's where the main gap is.
And I hate to overcomplicate this because the more we're talking, I'm starting to realise the impact of treaty settlements too might actually trigger something as well.
So there's a proposal that land
on a balance in my mind, because I think about marae that may want to have kaumātua housing in that established in the future. They might want to put a rest home on a piece of land adjoining to them, something like that. But just thinking a bit more broadly now. Thank you.
So yes, Māori reservation land is picked up under that definition of Māori ancestral land. But if there are any other, I think if there's other gaps, I'll make sure I send the links to all the detail, because it would be really good to make sure we're not missing anything inadvertently. Yep, I'll do that. So we're nearly at the end of this mammoth national direction. The last one probably to talk about today, with the caveat that we will soon need to talk about the growing for housing growth piece, is about the NES around granny flats. Although we have previously made comments about them being called granny flats, when the reality is it's not just grannies who are living in them. Sometimes it's grandpas, sometimes it's adult children, sometimes it's someone else entirely. But fundamentally, this isn't dramatically different from what our district plan already allows for. It basically allows for the granny flat or the minor dwelling to be a little bit bigger. So this could be a simple, yeah.
The one per site.
I think it's about, I think there's a couple of elements. I think there was an element of not wanting to then end up with 5 or 6 dwellings on a site without a subdivision occurring, because then people might build shared service, like shared connections, and basically set up a future problem. But I think the reality is that building a granny flat's not cheap, and I would say there are probably relatively few scenarios where someone would have a property that was of a size that would allow them to have multiple granny flats, and also the means, I guess, to invest that level of capital into a typical residential property. So I think it was kind of that, and it was kind of not taking this too far, where it would deliver and create a whole lot of complexity, where it would deliver relatively few benefits. As I say, we're probably out of time to talk about this one for today. We'll figure out a pathway for doing. But to summarise, key next step will be for myself to go away and draft a submission based on what we've talked about today, and I'll aim to get that to you by, say, the 20th of July, to allow for some feedback on the nature of the submission, before then getting it in on the 27th. And in the meanwhile, we'll also produce that evidence for MPI on the highly productive land piece, because they indicated getting that evidence earlier would be helpful and might give us more opportunity, I guess, to make sure that our evidence is considered properly.
And I guess that presentation will go onto our portal so we can see it, and then you can reference the parts that we hadn't finished discussing. And if we can get feedback to those parts, cool.
I had just wanted to quickly touch on, or just, I guess, give comfort to the table that we are considering this alongside the broader resource management package, and considering the impact of that on the district plan work program, just to give confidence that we're not sort of just blindly charging on with plan changes without thinking about how they might be impacted by this. And we're keeping connected in with Wellington and engaging in the reforms so that we're getting the information sort of as quickly as we can, and responding to it as best we can. Any final questions or comments?
Okay, just for your info, we do have a couple of apologies today. Jonathan is away overseas. Rogan did email to say he didn't think there was anything important for us to cover today. We've got Sam, who's cook and is unable to be with us. Who am I missing?
Excuse himself.
Mike, call back to work.
Okay, Mike has excused himself. Who else are we missing? Oh, Paul is an apology as well. I think that's it. So, yeah, pretty top team here, Vi. You're right. We'll go.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, and thanks for the opportunity to present the 2025 Resident Satisfaction Survey results, or Voice of the Customer results. This is part of our commitment to listening to the community voices and being transparent with what we're hearing. Resident satisfaction surveys are a valuable tool that help us to understand how we're performing and to ensure we stay connected to what matters most in our community or to our community. The purpose of our presentation today is to share with you what we've heard, highlight key insights, and most importantly, invite your guidance on how we respond. We'd like to know, do these results align with what you're hearing in the community, and are you comfortable with the focus areas that we've identified? And we'll talk to that throughout this presentation. So, from Triangle today, you'll get to see, know what we've done, see the survey results, and please, if you can share your thoughts and feedback around what those results are telling us, are they what you're hearing, and do they align with what you think we should be doing with them in terms of next directions. So, an overview of what we've done, we sent out 9 surveys to around 8,200 ratepayers on our emailable database. We received over 15,000 responses and achieved the satisfaction rate of 63.26%. So that means 63.26% of the respondents or the responses were satisfied with our service. While our NPS sits at minus 7.1, this is consistent with national public sector averages, and the sample size that we took, so the confidence level there shows 95% with a margin of error of 3 to 7%. So that means if we were to go out and do the survey again, we'd expect that 95% of the responses that we got back in the second round would fall within similar responses with a margin of error of 3 to 7%. So a robust or statistically robust confidence level.
Sorry, just going back to that very first figure that you said, 8,200 emailable ratepayers, is that how many we've got on our database now? Isn't it? Out of 13,000 ratepayers.
I don't know the exact number of ratepayers. I would have said it's up around the 18.
I know the rate. Yeah, it's about 19,000. Yeah, so we're under 50% in terms of that.
On this slide, you'll see that the picture on here just talks about how NPS is calculated. So, mentioned before on the previous slide, an NPS of negative 7.1. The typical way to calculate an NPS is that when you rate on a scale of 1 to 10, 0 to 6 is seen as a detractor, passives are 7 and 8, and those that support or promoters are a 9 and 10. The way that we actually calculate ours, we're a lot harsher on ourselves, and we actually count everything from 0 to 8 as a detractor, and we include the passives in our calculation. Top community, so just back on the key findings, top community concerns are crime, healthcare and population growth. Most discussed topics, roading, water and rubbish. That's been consistent year on year. Maybe just a bit of a change as to what was the top talking point this year round. Roading was the top talking point. Last year was water. NPS by age, we've got a really positive NPS scoring across the board for 65 plus, and there has been a decline in NPS this year for the 18 to 49 age groups. And then ease of doing business was the top detractor, with only 41.7% of those surveys being satisfied with, agreed with the comments that it's easy to do business with council. As part of our annual resident satisfaction surveys, we go down to each of the services that we provide. Some of those are linked to performance or KPIs that are in our SSPs that are in our long-term plan, and we've gone through and done year-on-year comparisons for each of these areas. And just quickly here, rubbish and recycling improved across all areas, which was great to see. Library services again this year continue to be one of our top performers. Shannon Library again scoring 100%, just highlighting that again for this year that was from a very small base. Yep. How small? Oh gosh, I think it was less than 10. Yeah. Still though, those 10 people were all very satisfied. Yes. Three waters results were mixed. Some slight gains in stormwater, but dips in wastewater and water tanks. And parks, halls and cemeteries did see a general decrease in satisfaction. Cool. And so now we're just looking at those individually. And so you can see here on these slides as we quickly move through them, the yellow arrows indicates that there has been a insignificant increase or decrease. Green basically means there's been an up means an increase, and red arrow down means a decrease. And happy for you to stop me as I move through these. I think the slides probably talk for themselves. If you have any questions.
Sorry, just going back to the three waters one. A question there: water tanks mandatory? Do we actually ask them whether we should have mandatory water tanks?
Correct. That's one of the questions, whether we should introduce those.
Okay.
So looking good across rubbish and recycling. And transport looks to improve or remain constant with year on year across all of their metrics. Library services, so we mentioned that has been one of our top performers, and you'll see they're really high in the 90s for the majority of their services there. Parks, halls and cemeteries, we've seen a decrease across the board. Connecting with our community, we've seen an increase across the board here. And you'll note in here, in previous years, one of the major detractors for council in the satisfaction survey results have been council's responsiveness. So you might be pleased to see that on this slide here, on the left-hand side at the bottom there, council responsiveness has gone up 9.1%.
What does the none mean? All of them, in brackets.
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. That comes through with the reporting. But I can check that. I'll come back later. And then for the customer satisfaction year-on-year leadership and reputation results, you'll be pleased to note that across the board here we've seen increase. That yellow line there, very significantly, insignificant decline, 0.3% for transparency. So although easy to do business was last year's major detractor, there has been an increase this year. It's still again this year our major detractor. Quality of life. You will note from earlier in the presentation we talked about crime being one of the biggest talking points. In this year's result, you'll see there the top left hand side, a safe place has gone down by 6.1%. So this is where we ask respondents to whether they agree or disagree that Horowhenua is a safe place to live. But other than that, across the board, we've seen either stable or an increase in those metrics for quality of life.
The one that sticks out here, Vi, is the healthcare accessible number. Plus 15% seems to be interesting to see that. Why? Because if anything, we sort of asked a lot about the issues that arise about health accessibility. So it'd be interesting to understand. Maybe 2024 was an anomaly or something, but seems amazingly high, that 51%. Well, a big increase.
Thanks, Mayor Bernie. And it's possible that there could have been comments that came through with some of those responses. So something that we can do is have a look through the comments that came through. And if there are, that give us some indication as to why there might be a higher satisfaction rate, we can certainly do some analysis on that.
It's also listed as a top concern, yeah, which is the point you're making, I think, Bernie, isn't it? Yeah, it's mismatch, yeah.
And in summary, so customer satisfaction remains above the national average, but momentum has flattened, so a slight decrease from last year. The biggest detractor is in the metric easy to do business with. Leadership, presentation and visibility is still influential on the customer satisfaction results, and you would have seen that in the previous CSAT results for leadership. And our focus for 2026 will be to make it easier to do business with Council and stay responsive to the top community concerns. So, as you've highlighted, healthcare, population growth, roading and crime. And that picture that's down the bottom there is our correlation that shows for the metric easy to do business with, that for the promoters, it's not so easy to see on that screen, so let me just pick that up a bit better. The stronger the...
Just on that, what we're going to look to do in 2026, how do we achieve that in terms of healthcare and crime, which is predominantly driven by central government, not us, you know? What does our role look like in that space?
Yeah, great question. And I guess maybe just flipping it back and being a bit curious back to councillors, like, that's a great question. What is our role? What should we be doing? And is there more, that council officers should be doing to maybe be advocates or whether council advocates or...
My other question, Vi, was in terms of roading. Is the roading NZTA issue, or is it a local roading issue? It would be interesting to know, whether they've been influenced by what's happening with O2NL and other roading projects like that, or is it just all based on the roundabout at Queen Street that took so long? Who knows?
Thanks for the question and comments. Look, it's difficult because this is based on a series of questions and a capture at that point of time.
Yes.
And depending on what's going on there, like there have been some decisions made around O2NL design changes, for example, that happened not long after that. And so one of the things actually that you'll see in the next slide of one of the ways to address the next 12 months in terms of focus areas is to expand on our real-time feedback collection. Such as this. So rather than relying on a once a year resident satisfaction survey that we do, is look to ways to expand on those that we currently do for things like building consents for the aquatic centre, where we solicit that feedback a lot more frequently, and start to do that across the board with these sorts of surveys as well. And that's not dissimilar to other councils that go out. Most of them actually go out quarterly and capture some quarterly statistics and feedback, and then have a once a year kind of wrap up of what that looks like. So we don't have that design just yet, and I don't have all the answers just now, but that's certainly a focus area for 2026 and 25-26. And so, thank you. A good segue into the other things to focus areas for the next 12 months. Will also to improve the sample quality, and so one of the things that will come with going out and more frequently soliciting that feedback will be hopefully garnering a few more responses from different people based on either directly after one of their interactions with council, so getting a lot more real-time, real experience feedback that comes in, but also you might get the same person coming back 4 times. Let's say we do it quarterly, and we can have a look through the individualised NPS to see how we might be tracking in terms of their experience with council. Up or down. And to lift the ease of doing business. Again, I've harped on about this a few times now, still being our top detractor, is actually look at our internal processes. This feeds into things like the customer service excellence strategy that we have and some of the mahi we're doing in that space. So we will bring that back to the table and have a look at, we'll bring that back to officers to have a look at how that might fit in with some of the mahi we're doing in that space too. Again, don't have the answers just yet, but that's what the next 12 months looks like, is how we can feed that into our current operational workload.
I saw some media attention to Wellington's results over the weekend, and it appeared that they named about half a dozen councils that were still doing this. This is not a requirement that we do it. We are doing this for our own benefits in terms of understanding. Yeah.
You're absolutely right, that's correct. There's no statutory requirement to go out and do a survey like this, but there is for us to measure and report on our on SSP, so some of the statutory requirements on us from things like Three Waters, but also where we set performance measures and the LTP around reporting on that too, and customer satisfaction rates. So going out and doing this is a way for us to be able to go back and factually to the community, show them where we've achieved those. So I guess coming back to those questions at the beginning, and I should have written this in a slide, so I'm just going to quickly go through that. Apologies, don't look at the screen. So just going back to those 2 questions, are the results that you've seen in the report that we sent to you, although it's in a PowerPoint format, I decided not to go through the 40 odd slides that are in there and talk to those point by point, but do they reflect kind of the what you're hearing in the community? Do they align? Are there anomalies? Are there other focus areas that you would like officers to incorporate into the customer service excellence mahi for the next 12 months? And then out of those areas for the next steps for us and those focused commitments, do we have any sort of allergic reactions to them? Do they look reasonable? You're happy to support officers down that route? Or are there things missing, again, that you'd like us to add?
For me, it's snapshot in time. So I think the direction to actually build a quarter by quarter view would be helpful. There in terms of what we're chasing, I would, to Ross's point, be focusing on the ones we have direct control over versus ones where we hold an advocacy position only, accepting that health will always be a key concern, but that's at the central government level. We hold an advocacy role, we're not a service delivery model, so I don't think we should necessarily chase that. I think one of the things, when we look at what could we do better, footpaths is the number one, and in fairness, I would suggest that that's not about what we put into footpaths and what we're doing, it's around how we're telling the story. And so have we, as a council, better communicated the fact that the footpath budget was significantly invested, this is what's there, this is what it turns into. So I think sometimes it's the storytelling piece. Picking up that cycleways is another key area where our community are telling us we could do better, and obviously more of it in the what do we want, the recycling and the rubbish that we're already telling us we're actually doing pretty well anyway, but our community are telling us in here that they want more of that as well. So hopefully that kind of helps, but I think chase the areas where we've got levers we can pull and have direct influence over, and potentially better tell the stories where some of the community feedback is we need more footpaths when it's clear that we've actually already taken action and made significant investment into that space.
Just picking up, I agree with Clint, everything Clint said. Picking up on those things over which we have little direct control, I think back to the O2NL, the advocacy from council as part of a collective around the district, but there was absolute leadership from council on that along with the other players. And I just think on those very sensitive issues, I think of the healthcare, the issue maybe of crime, where council can be more visibly present and can tell that story about how it is advocating, and to actually look for opportunities to show a leadership role. So where there are other voices in the community, important voices that talk about, for example, that have challenges around healthcare, the council not only supports them but actually is seen to be leading and networking in the charge. We can do good stuff there, and I think in the past we quietly often have done it quietly, but it's about being seen to do it. So yeah, I just want to underline that, because while I agree with Clint that we do need to focus on doing what we do well, the community wants us to be more than that. They want us to be a voice in those matters over which we have no direct control, but where we have the resources and the ability to be a voice.
Looking at it purely from a governance point of view, I think why is the questions around connecting with our community in terms of decision making, public involvement. I mean, while it's gone up, 54% only think that there is sufficient public involvement. So, yeah, when they talk about the next one down, the feedback process has gone up to 73%. So it would be nice to understand why they don't believe that there is sufficient public involvement in decision making, and the same again around being well informed. Yet our communication strategy is obviously working, because there's a lot more people feel that they are happy with the way that we are communicating with them. So that would be one area that I'm and I suppose the other area is still that easy to do business with. You know, where one of the signals we're sending that say we're not And is that particularly in the resource management space or consenting space, or is that other bits of the business that we're not? Because when you see the responsiveness have been increased, we're obviously making things easier for people, but for some reason that's transferring into those sorts of numbers. And I don't know how you understand that or get some more detail on that, but those are the sorts of things that I'd be looking at would be the ease to do business with, and that responsiveness alone would be key things for me.
Thanks, Mayor Bernie, and maybe just in response to that, one of the benefits of going out and soliciting feedback more frequently, particularly if it's happened directly after an experience of someone through council's processes, is if that person is in our database, we've got their details, we can see that, let's say they've been a resource consent applicant, we can actually then track their responses based on their experiences. And so, though we could do that now, it's challenging because we've got that across all of the surveys that we sent out all at once, and several of the respondents responded to more than one of those surveys and to several questions. So I guess the work is a whole lot more involved than it would be for the smaller snapshots that we might be getting every quarter.
Just want to introduce Mark, Matt, and you of course know Sam, but so this is a process that has actually started in 2023, probably, where we've been talking about the future of Horowhenua District public transport, and it's been a number of discussions over a little bit of time. In fact, Horowhenua was on the initial committee along with myself, which I've continued. No one else has shown an interest that want to get involved, but we thought it was important today to get you to understand where we're at and what are the next steps and what's likely to happen over the next little while, because obviously some public consultation needs to be undertaken and things like that. But Matt and Mark have been working pretty hard on this now for a little while, and it'll be interesting to see your reaction to some of the proposed routes and some of the things that are around, but I can assure you that it's undergone scrutiny from a number of different people, and I just want to acknowledge Sam's work in terms of leading this. He's been instrumental in making sure that it's been a topic that we've been talking about, and if you're up with the play with their annual plan, long-term plan, they have actually committed some funding. Haven't you? You have? Yeah, you have. Oh, no, I have. That's to come for us. But you have committed some future funding, yeah. So I'll hand over to Mark and the team. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, kia ora koutou, ko Sam Ferguson, tōku ingoa. Good to see you all. Do we have any councillors online?
No.
Okay.
They're either sick or overseas.
Right, yeah. No, fair enough. Yeah, so as Bernie said, just the opportunity to give you all a bit of an update. I thought I might just take a minute to kind of recover the lay of the land. Kia ora, Justin. And the team have shared some of the maps around the current routes. I think it's fair to say, from my point of view, our community is underserved by public transport, and we've had aspirations to address that for quite a long time, and it's taken time to get to this stage for various reasons, and I won't go through all of those. But in recent years, some of the context, we had through the long-term plan a reasonably solid proposal for investment, but that included co-investment from Waka Kotahi, NZTA, and they didn't come to the table. And that was a common story across the country around funding public transport. And so that's really set us back a number of months, probably 9 months or so, until we've made a decision, as Bernie indicated, through our annual plan process, to go alone with funding. So the normal model is that effectively it's 50-50 government money and ratepayer funds. What we're proposing to the community, we've proposed it to the community and consulted the community on it, is that we will put ratepayer funding in without that being matched by central government. But the result is we've got a smaller budget that we're working within. So we haven't increased the budget that was proposed. So I think that context is important, and that's because we're not able to do everything that could be done on day one of delivering public transport services. So we've had to do some prioritisation, and we don't know what the future will hold. I would like to think that we may see that funding from central government at some stage, and with the work we're doing, that will help kind of give the options for what the future services could look like. So yeah, there'll be a staggered work. Not everything will come on day one, but it will be a journey. So that's probably the main thing I wanted to kind of outline. Actually, just the other thing is the groups that have been involved in this up to this stage. So as Bernie mentioned, he's been actively involved. We've also had Di Rump from Mōpuku engaging, and Shane Royal from Te Tūmata Kahoki engaging. So just keeping our iwi partners
across this conversation and the opportunity for them to have input. And the approach, which I'm really supportive of, is a joint governance group. So these are decisions that we need to be making as both councils together. And the key reason for that is that, one, it's the same communities that we're serving, but two, is there's infrastructure dependencies. Where we run the buses, we need to put bus stops, we need paint on the roads. So working together is a really key approach here. But yeah, that's kind of my opening comments and observations. I'll let Mark and Matt work through the
Kia ora. Thank you, Sam, and kia ora koutou councillors. Thanks very much for having us here. As I said, my name's Mark Reid, so I manage our transport team at Horizons, so look after all things public transport across the region. Matt Bray is one of our transport planners, probably my silent partner who does all the work in the background. So we'll take some notes, no doubt, for us today as well. In terms of a few things we're talking about here today, I guess the presentation is focused around bus services, future bus services. I'll premise that I'm certainly happy to have a bit of a conversation around passenger rail as well, because I know that will probably be front of mind for some of you, and what the future may hold, both with the current Capital Connection service and then future improvements to that, in terms of investment from government and ourselves alongside Greater Wellington Regional Council. So that will be a little more of an off-the-cuff conversation, but in terms of the presentation, really just an opportunity, hopefully, to bring up to speed with public transport. I imagine probably not many of you engage with public transport in a meaningful way here in Horowhenua. As Sam said, there's not a lot of it out there. So it really serves on the margins as far as the transport network goes. So just talk a little bit about, what our function is and that how we work alongside yourselves as District Council, where some of our sort of roles sit, and then into what's sort of some of the current process we're looking at for improvements to that public transport across the district. So sort of a little bit of 101, I guess, who does what. Horizons are responsible for some of our very high level regional transport planning documents. The big one for us in the public transport space is the Regional Public Transport Plan. That also sets objectives for our districts and city councils. So some of your infrastructure team can probably look at that and say, hey, look, this is directing us where there is public transport to be able to support those types of activities on the roading network. And you can see that play out a little bit on the right hand side around some of that very sort of operational on the ground type of infrastructure that we do need to support that. But fundamentally the breakdown is Horizons plan, manage, deliver the services side, and we're certainly looking to work in partnership with Horowhenua around some of the on-street infrastructure, poles, signs, shelters if they're there. This is what drives a lot of our work in the public transport space, which is the Regional Public Transport Plan. Sam is chair of our Passenger Transport Committee, the committee that did a bit of work a few years ago now, and that really shifted us from, towards a more aspirational plan and some real big future targets. One of those there around sort of increases in public transport patronage. Really is pushing council towards investing more in public transport and really looking at how we deliver our services across the region. I would say without bits of work like this one, we probably wouldn't see council signalling investment as it has in public transport across Horowhenua. There's a lot of really good work still to come through this. Obviously we haven't delivered everything we want to through it. We're sort of 3 years into what is a 10-year plan. But Service in Horowhenua was certainly one of those that we heard through this process and have heard subsequently through our long-term plan and annual plan consultation process as well. So we're certainly hearing from the community that there is a need and there is a real desire for, other options for transport than just the private vehicle. And yeah, public transport certainly fills one of those needs. And this is obviously the Horowhenua side, so won't dwell on this, but I'm sure it's one that you and the team here know well. In terms of existing services, and we've handed out the current timetable, and I guess while it's a nice booklet and it looks like it's got lots of pages in it, there's only really a handful of services that run, most of them not even daily. The only daily service is the Lynn to Palmerston North commuter service, runs up to Palmerston North in the morning and then back in the evening. Certainly serves a good purpose for those commuters. The others, again, are really serving smaller groups who might want to access services for shopping or healthcare, or to get out somewhere to get a haircut or something like that. It's really probably on the margins of who these services are going to be really useful for. It's great to have them there, so it does give people options in those communities. We do have services that span quite a wide area. They're just not necessarily that frequent as it currently stands. So good to think about what's currently there, and certainly a lot of these services are well used for regional services, so it's not like they're sort of falling over or there's not people on them currently. It just doesn't offer a lot of choice for people who are looking to travel. The IT timetable, if anyone does want a B card, just to give a bit of a shout out, so B card what we currently travel with in terms of our Smart Pay cards. Got some leads if any councillors want to grab one and get on the bus at some stage. Really easy to use, and yes, we are in hopefully next year sometime moving to the new national system, which will see a change to this, but another exciting change for public transport across the country.
Where do they get those from?
B cards can be brought on the bus. We also sell them at the library. Yeah, so the library here they can, and we actually worked with council here to be able to set up a B card computer at the library where someone can go in and log into the B card website and do that online. So
the outside opening hours not available.
Only on the bus if you wanted to top up.
Only on the bus.
Yeah. Outside opening hours there. It's usually online, on the bus, or in one of the Horizons offices.
For your off-peak service on the Wednesdays, will you have an afternoon service? I've just got one that's, but for the early birds.
Yeah, Wednesday, yeah. So
would there be an afternoon one?
Not on
Palmerston.
From Palmerston's back, yes. Yes, there is.
Is
it not?
Is it just a morning one?
No, that should be.
2:30.
I think there's a title that should say PM.
Oh, is that PM?
North Boulevard.
Okay.
That says AM, it should be PM. So leave at 2:30.
You print them, and the first thing you notice is a mistake. Yes, that bus returning from Palmerston North is PM. There we go.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then just talk a little bit about, looking forward. Actually, I won't put it up there. I'll come back to that. So, as Sam and Bernie said, there's been a governance group that's been set up, working for a couple of years now. Horizons Council signalled through our long-term plan investment in public transport in Horowhenua, and I guess reconfirmed that through our annual plan, albeit without NZTA co-funding. Like you, most of what we do in the transport space is with NZTA funding assistance rate. We haven't typically in the past funded public transport without it, though we are going down that path now in Wanganui and Horowhenua. So I guess council have supported that need and supported the community, and again we heard really positively from our communities through the most recent annual plan consultation in support of doing that. So how we've usually run this process is to work across the joint governance group between Horizons, District Council and other sort of partners through that, to be able to deliver eventually at the other end, hopefully, what is a great service for the community. And to give some context to what that looks like potentially within the Horowhenua. So maybe the best way to break this down is sort of those bottom 3 bullet points, where for public transport, Horowhenua urban residents currently pay about $4.50 per 100k of capital value. Most of that is for the existing bus service, total mobility, which I haven't spoken about today, not on here, but total mobility is a subsidised taxi service for those with long-term sort of disabilities or impairments. They can provide a good level of service for them, and sort of the small contribution towards the capital connection. Under the current scenarios in terms of funding level of service, that would increase to somewhere around $12-13 per 100k of capital value. And for comparison, there is the Manawatu district, so mostly Fielding residents. That will actually go up slightly for 25-26 year from around $10. It'll probably be comparable in terms of around $12 per 100k. So it's not necessarily about, hey, look, who pays what, because if you compare yourself to others, Palmerston North will pay a lot more, Wanganui now will pay a lot more, but I guess what we're looking at is something that is balanced between wanting to deliver a level of service on public transport and balancing that with the cost of doing so to ratepayers. And then us, as I guess sort of public transport professionals, have to go away and try and work out, well, how do you deliver that best bang for buck, that best value? Where do people want to get to or from in terms of their travel, especially on public transport? We know that for the most part, not always, as you come in sort of this time of day, although it's school holidays and traffic's backed up, quite a bit down Queen Street. For the most part, Levin's a pretty easy place to get around at a lot of times a day. So how do you make public transport work best for those who are going to want to use it, need to use it? So there's a lot of things there which go into that. And as Mayor Bernie said, there'll be most certainly a piece of consultation with the public in the coming future to be able to ask some of those questions of the public as well, and to be able to check in around, I guess, what we're proposing should we get there. And the next couple of slides talk a little bit about what those improvements could look like, and I'll just probably preface and say these are still a work in progress, so don't get too caught up about sort of lines on maps or things like that at this stage. We're certainly working through that process, and we'll be very open to any feedback on that space. And in terms of what can we deliver in terms of public transport investment in Horowhenua, there's really two main areas. There's the VIN urban bus option, which obviously there is no current public transport option within the urban area for those living in the VIN. And then there's the regional connections. So how can we move people better or provide more options for people travelling between, be it the VIN and Palmerston North or vice versa? The VIN and Waikanae for people to access the train service, perhaps to be able to get to and from Wellington if that's where they want to go. Equally in our conversations with Greater Wellington Regional Council, communities like Otaki who need to access healthcare services or other services in Levin. So it's not just a one-way option there. There are those who want to be able to travel both ways along those sections. Currently, if you want to commute by public transport to Palmas North to Levin for work, you wouldn't be able to do that. And we know of staff here actually who have spoken about wanting to have those options. So it's providing that connection for them. And there is going to be a balance between a good level of service for both of those two areas. Based on the level of investment we have, we won't be able to necessarily do sort of that Rolls Royce type service, nor might the community want to pay for that. So there will certainly be that balance, and still a bit to go there. So, as I said, regional connections are generally slightly easier to get off the ground. Usually you pretty much just run a bus down the state highway or the main road, and they're going between Palmas North and Levin. There's only so many options. Just going between Levin and Waikanae, again, only so many options, and we think there are some good ways to be able to provide a better level of service to those within some of those rural towns and communities to be able to have them access Levin as well. So we think there are some good options there in terms of regional and town centre connections. In terms of Levin urban, it can look a little bit like a sort of a spaghetti monster, depending on how you want to draw it. But we also think there are some good options around a Levin service which might have 2 or 3. So this has got 3 showing up there, but 2 or 3 sort of connecting routes across town, which provide people the opportunity to either access the town centre or change buses in a pretty efficient manner in the town centre to be able to access another part of the town, be it the health centre in the southeast, or maybe some of the employment opportunities in the southwest, or train station now or into the future. So this is probably, I'd say from a public perspective, it's the more difficult one to get right. To a certain extent, we can put a professional lens on it as much as we want. It really needs that engagement with the community and hearing from them. Hey, look, what are our times of day we need to travel? Where do we need to get to? Is weekends the same as weekdays? Are we better to focus our investment on weekdays as opposed to weekends, and all those little trade-offs that come with that? So that's really some of the work that is certainly still to come. And these are sort of some of the questions, those top 3 that we've been asking with the governance group so far around, is the network development on the right track? What other considerations need to be included? Are we comfortable with sort of where we're heading? And at this stage, looking like we're going out for sort of public engagement around August. Definitely conscious of upcoming government elections and not wanting to get too late into that piece. But equally, if we don't do it now, so to speak, or don't at least have that level of engagement with the community now, we probably lose another 6 months by the time we get a new council, new passenger transport committee, potentially new governance group set up to be able to, continue the sort of engagement that's been ongoing. There's a bit more work into next year as we head towards delivery of service sort of further into 2026. That might be it in a nutshell. We're really happy to answer any questions on the bus side of things, and then maybe happy to ad-lib anything passenger rail related if people would like that after.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. And I'm coming from almost a zero-based knowledge, so forgive me if I ask the odd questionable question. So we're looking at a potentially much enhanced service with regional councils showing leadership and saying we will front up with the money without the normal subsidy. All sounds good, but I just need to understand at present how successful the model is before I understand whether I endorse the future, if you will. So you talked about those 7 considerations, which look very good to me. How well do you think they are being met with the present designs? That's the first question.
We're certainly seeing improvements across the region. So, taking a couple of examples over the last couple of years in the Horizons region, a couple of years ago we instigated a new service in Wanganui called The Tide, which was the first time in quite some time that Horizons had invested more money in public transport in Wanganui, and Patronage, which has been in decline for a number of years at that point, more than doubled as a result of installing that one service, which has then subsequently seen us move more towards that model for Wanganui as a community, because we've seen that success and the community has told us that that's what they're after. I guess that's an example of success where we've invested. I would say that shouldn't be a given just because, hey, look, we're going to put money into public transport and live in, and it's going to suddenly work and people are going to suddenly get on the bus. But I do think that that engagement piece and hearing from the community and engaging with them and what is going to work best for them will be really important. I would say while council have signalled budgets in the long-term plan and annual plan, again, we don't want to assume that is currently right-sized for the community. If they come back and say to us, hey, look, we actually only want this element or this part of it, and we want to pay for that part of it and not those other things, then maybe that will be what's right-sized for the community, and that's where we land.
So I'll sharpen the question. This is parochial. This is Horowhenua. So the 7 considerations, how do you feel, how well are they being met on the delivery at this level where Horowhenua is linking to, be it, internally or to Palmerston North? How, if I were the customer, how well would I tick each of the 7 boxes at present, do you feel?
Again, breaking down to 2 between sort of regional services and live-in services. Regional services, really well. It's very clear what people are wanting to get to from a regional transport perspective. They want to access better services south in Wellington, north in Palmerston North, or from the regional communities into live-in. From a live-in focus perspective, there's more uncertainty there, and I'd say that is a harder one for us to be more certain of. That yes, we're going to get really good value for money in that investment. And as Sam would say, sometimes there is a sort of a build and they will come, but understand that can also be really hard as well.
Thank you. And second question is around the stats, the usage, if you will. So looking at the options in the booklet, what is the uptake? What do the stats look like in terms of usage for each of those services?
I would struggle off the top of my head. So I know that on some Horowhenua services, we're sort of for around 13, 14, 15 people per trip, which across our regional services is good. But yeah, that's me trying to pull some information I've got from some time ago.
I can give you an anecdotal response, and that was catching a Wednesday afternoon bus from Palmerston North back to Levin last year. There wasn't a seat available, but that was just before Christmas. I think there was quite a few people choosing to be in Palmy for shopping, but yeah, no seats available. That's been my personal experience on one bus trip.
Point is, they do get used, and there was some data there. Yeah, Yeah, and clearly without stating the obvious, which I will, it'd be good to have the solid data to say, look, here's what it's looking like at present, here's what the projected stats could be, therefore based on present usage.
Maybe to be a bit more less glib. And if we compare to, I mean, we've done some significant changes in Wanganui and Palmerston North, and they're both different communities, so absolutely get it. But so in Wanganui, as Mark said, there were buses running on a 2-hour frequency, and what they call a coverage model. So it almost takes the scenic route to get from A to B. And comparable, it's about 40 minutes on the bus and about 10 minutes in the car. So it's not really putting priority into passengers' time. The trial route that we've introduced in Wanganui is running directly through the city every 20 minutes from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And we're still seeing patronage growth after 2 years. So that, I mean, it takes time for people to change their travel patterns and habits. But that, yeah, for me, there's really clear evidence that when we deliver reliable services that people can plan their days around, the challenge is, what does that need to look like for this community? So, as Mark says, certainly around live-in services, and this is the discussion we've been having of what's right size, and it's a genuine question.
And look, just an observation in terms of basic values. So I know personally of a Foxtonian, second chance education person in her 40s who is undertaking a nursing course in Palmerston North, and her words to me were, if it were not for that service, she couldn't do it. She simply couldn't afford it. So that's the other side of the coin, you know, taking the stats and other important stuff out of it, just looking at this enables people who otherwise would not have access to whatever to have that access. Thank you.
Could you just go back on what I'm keen to just double confirm is that regional connection from Palmerston North and Wellington, and if we're seeing any proposed increases in that level of service, or I understand is that the piece where you just haven't got the budget to deliver it right now, but certainly
so at the moment, in terms of this package, which we've looked at sort of 3 to 4 trips per day between Levin and Waikanae. Currently, that service is set up such that it is the local share is co-funded between Horizons Regional Council and Greater Wellington Regional Council. So we would look to continue that, such that the cost is again spread further across those various ratepayers which are benefiting. But yeah, so currently that service is twice a week on a Tuesday and Thursday. To see it and improve to multiple times a day to work alongside the Capital Connection service. So that obviously provides an earlier morning service south and later evening service back, but to work through the middle of the day as well would see those benefits.
And just keen on, I guess, the urban design of the urban route. So level of consultation with Ministry of Education, particularly around connectivity to schools, and the option of opting the funding that they contract out and provision to go towards this sort of concept. Are those discussions happening, advanced?
So they're not advanced, but yes, they will happen. We have to, I'm pretty sure as a right, consult with the Ministry of Education around it. Something we're really mindful of, because what we've seen play out in the Palmerston North Ashes community is that where we put on public transport, the Ministry may look at that and say, we look to pull back on Ministry of Education funded services. The line we've got around those current services is there's no ability for them to, say, co-fund a public service or work together with us. It's a very hard, yes, we will fund services where there are eligible students, or no, we will not where there are ineligible students. And public transport can be one of those components they look at.
just add, so yeah, from my knowledge of the local community, we're seeing more of those services for our rural schools, and that's where the likes of Oho, for example, if we're running a bus from Levin to Waikanae, public transport service, there's a risk that the Ministry of Education see that now that there's a public transport service, they don't need to be providing that school service to Oho School, as an example. So yeah, we're conscious of that.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about passenger rail?
Or just next steps with this?
Next steps. So, yeah, we're looking to be able to put together, a package to be able to go to the community in the near future. Again, we are really interested in right-sized both around what we're doing, but also the level of investment. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges that I've come to learn coming to work for the Regional Council in the last few years is public transport. You can put one thing in the budget, but it may not necessarily be what the community wants. They might want slightly more or slightly less or slightly different. So we'll certainly be working with the governance group. What will be the new governance group as we head into next year, following that sort of public engagement piece this year. And one of the results of that could be that, hey, look, there are some easy wins there. There are some things around regional services where we've had really strong feedback that, hey, look, we want to be able to access north or south or rural communities access Levin. And maybe there's some harder pieces where there's a little bit more work to get that just right around Levin. But certainly I think the future in Levin includes public transport in some form as you continue to grow and the community and town centre continues to change. And then just picking up briefly on passenger rail, so you'll all be aware probably the Capital Connection service run by KeyRail runs once a day from Palmerston North to Wellington and return Wellington to Palmerston North in the evening, and that Horizons have been working with Greater Wellington Regional Council on a plan to purchase new rolling stock for that service and a service between Wellington and Marston, and to increase the level of service on that line. So it would go to 4 trips per day, per weekday from Palmerston North to Wellington, and 4 from Wellington to Palmerston North, and then 2 on a weekend in each direction. As we currently stand right now, we're in sort of the final throes of procurement, and then also the various funding partners doing their due diligence and sign-offs around it. So that includes Horizons Regional Council, Greater Wellington, the Crown through Ministry of Transport, NTTA and QRail. So a number of parties all involved around there who need to make sure everyone's comfortable with the investment that's going to be a 40-year investment for passenger rail in the Lower North Island. All going well, we'll be looking to hopefully have announcements in the near future, and again getting that across the line, new trains in service sort of 2029. So you're looking between O2NL and passenger rail options north and south as quite a change in the transport landscape across the district around that similar time frame, and is a really exciting piece for us anyway to be involved with from a passenger rail perspective. And it's not something that Horizons could ever have delivered on our own. From a capital perspective, we're talking a $800 to $900 million capital project where Horizons are 1% of that, and the Crown is picking up 90% of that between NTTA and Crown top-ups. So it is a significant investment, one we wouldn't be able to lead on our own, and has the potential to be a real game changer for public transport across the region and into Wellington. and we're well aware of, I guess, some of the work going on around town centre and interest from council here around that as well. So definitely wanting to stay keyed in on work packages being let out here locally as well.
It's probably a question for Daniel in terms of where do we need to be as a organisation ready for, you know, discussions before next year's annual plan or long-term plan conversations. In terms of this, do we have to wait or till the consultation's sort of done and get the direction from these guys first before we start thinking about the impact that it's going to have or what our contribution needs to be?
Yeah, I think we can certainly do some early work alongside the public engagement process to understand what the cost implications will be. That alongside considerations in the recycling and the local water space may require us to consider a long-term plan amendment. So yeah, we'll certainly do the due diligence around the contributions that would be required and understand what a consultation process would look like for council share.
Thanks, team. Appreciate it. Yep. So how much more work do we need to do before August? Or is that you've got everything in hand there?
Probably more the comms piece. And we've done a few of them over the last few years, so we're sort of we're sort of aware of what it takes now. But yeah, we'll be keen in with officers here to make sure we can get out and about in the right locations to be able to talk with groups. We've got a meeting coming up with a stakeholder group in a fortnight or so's time, one early evening, which has been good to be able to leverage some of those relationships that the team here already have. So yeah, things like that we'll be doing. Yeah, really just trying to get the voice out there and word out there as much.
Yeah, I guess that's where talking about the consultation and the community engagement, there's certainly opportunity for councillors to step into that. I think so. A couple of examples where there could be some community interest and potentially some questions is so running a bus from Levin to Palmerston North 3 or 4 times a day via Foxton. So that's kind of shaping up as our preferred route in the whole, but obviously that's at the expense of Shannon. Shannon will be served by a more frequent train that's coming in 2029, and we'll also have a bus connection. But that's the type of conversation that the community may have some views on. And I mean, places like Horowhenua Beach, where we're proposing a service out there. It's not a high frequency service by any shape or form, but I think one of the questions we were grappling with is it better to be running 2 buses on one day or 1 bus on 2 separate days, and so that's where the community input's really helpful. I mean, in either case, it's a low level of service targeted at people generally that probably wouldn't have another option. Where some of the connections to Palmerston North, we were running 3 or 4 times a day, where we're opening up more options for people. So yeah, just different target groups, and I guess that's also the thing around Levin service. Who are the people who could be using this? We know that there are a number of our aged care providers have their own private vans and they do excursions. Would the bus service meet some of their needs? We have kids after school at sports training that need to get picked up by their parents. Is that a target market? So yeah, it's just around how will it meet the needs of our community, and if any councillors are through the consultation wanting to engage communities in those conversations, because as I said, we're genuinely interested in what the community think, and and how it could work or may not work for them.
Oh, can I just ask a question? Yeah. Hey, Sam, thanks for that. I've just been sitting here contemplating it all. I really appreciate what you've presented to us all here today, and I get the need and the future need. I suppose there were two little things for me that was when you talked about Hokea and that, and I think about those communities that are probably the most vulnerable and probably have the least available to help them to move around. But I also think about, there was two things that were on my mind. One was the time of the service starting from Levin, and the Waikanae thing, because I'm thinking the trains aren't coming till 29, and so I think about that, the workers that need to get to Waikanae on a daily, they're consistent, they're a captured crowd, and if there was a service that actually catered for them, that actually complemented the further services that you're going to provide, that was just one thing that crossed my mind, because that's sort of, they're guaranteed passengers. But then I thought about the other 4 providers that you talk about in our district, and the potential of 2 things. If you're doing your weighing up about running 1 bus, 2 bus, the cost effectiveness of that. One of those smaller providers to take care of those smaller areas as opposed to running a full bus. I do wonder, are there those considerations? The other thing that I was sort of thinking a little bit about was, hold on, bear with me, I just dropped it off my mind for a sec. It was the workers, the Hokea and the vulnerable. I'll come back to it. There was one more point that I just wanted to impress on. I'll think about it.
Yeah, so I can, and I'm sure Mark can add to this, but yeah, around vehicle types, vehicle sizes, it's a really common conversation in our communities. Generally, the majority of the cost in delivering a service is tied up with running a vehicle, and not so much the size of the vehicle, but fuel for a vehicle and the driver.
Your service. Yeah, other providers coming in and undercutting your service, which means that pushing people away from our public transport. So I just wanted to, that was the other one I was contemplating in my mind.
Yeah, so in terms of just the process, we go through a tendering process, and we've done this with Fielding, we've done this with Palmerston North. We've ended up with slightly different bus sizes as a result of that process. So the Palmerston North buses, they're fully electric, but they're slightly smaller than a full-size bus, but they're configured to, they support seating, but they also support standing at those peak times. So what that looks like in this community might be slightly different. And yeah, I guess it just being clear, the costs of running the service, a driver is a driver. If they're driving a van or a bus, they're being paid for their time, so that cost doesn't really change. And I mean, there is fuel usage differences, but driving a van or driving a bus out to Hokea Beach, there's not going to be a huge amount of cost variance there. But I mean, that's from my perspective, and I'm sure Mark can add to that if needed. But vulnerable community, I mean, this is exactly the stuff we're discussing, and acutely aware of it. We hear it through the older person's network, and we know that people are getting left behind by transport as a barrier to participating in society. So we know that exists, and it's how we address it.
Just a query, Mark, in terms of the consultation. Do you allude to or refer, how much depth do you go into in terms of cost and price, and the impact maybe on the ratepayer if you're basically trebling their rates in terms of that passenger transport thinking? Does that then become an issue for some people? I don't want my rates going up, sort of $100 a year when I'm either never going to spend that on public transport, or there's no way that I want to contribute. So I just wondered, we got rates capping to look forward to. Who knows what that might, how that might influence things. But just wondered sort of whether the community will understand the extra cost that they will incur because of this.
So part of that will certainly be, I guess, including what decisions and what's come before. So fundamentally, Horizons has been out through our long-term plan, especially a couple of years ago, where we signalled quite clearly potential increases at that point in the consultation in Horowhenua and Wanganui across some of our regional services. So it's not necessarily looking to relitigate that consultation that occurred, but there will certainly need to be that informing piece in there that, hey, look, this level of service, it doesn't come at zero cost. You don't create something out of nothing. So that will certainly be part of that. It'll just look slightly different to, say, LTP or annual plan, which are more financial focused, you might say, than what the service is actually look like as a result of that.
What is the charge between Levin and Palmerston North at the moment? Went up yesterday, didn't it?
No, it's not.
Not yet.
Not for us.
I think it was 7 on the B card.
It'll be $5 or $6 in the 3 zones. Then, it's $5.
Yeah.
$10 return.
Private chauffeur on a $300,000 vehicle is what it is.